So Shanina shared a little yesterday. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here with you yesterday, just about kind of the big picture why of SBL. Today we're going to dive into unit planning. There's probably, in all honesty, there's probably a few like trainings in between that should happen between what Shanina did and what I'm going to do today. So take a deep breath, try not to feel lost. I don't think that your union is expecting you to roll out standards-based learning in its entirety or even partially. Am I right? There's not a requirement in Lake Union for that, or I guess that would be at your conference level. Any conferences that are doing standards-based learning or have dabbling?
Yeah, we're in it. Yeah.
You're in it. Okay, tell me when you say you're in it, you guys are, what's your?
We've had multiple trainings over
Okay.
the past 3-4 years. Teachers have developed a unit plan, and this year my encouragement for those that are ready is that they do a whole subject area.
Wow, okay, so we do have some schools here that may be in a conference with the expectation to move forward with a unit plan. Okay, that helps me, thank you. So we are going to dive into what SBL looks like, units in an SBL classroom. So I think the most important takeaway is that the proficiency scale, and everybody familiar with from yesterday with Shanina what a proficiency scale is? The 0 to 4, and it's an articulation of the learning progression. I'll show you a little bit more here. I'll kind of do a little review on that. The proficiency scale becomes the heart of the classroom. I know when I first started teaching, the textbook was the heart of my classroom. I lived and died by the textbook or the stack of textbooks. I had my stack, I had the Basel readers and my math book and my history book, and every grade went through every one of those. I was thankful to learn about multi-grade cycles so we could do a little bit better there. But now the proficiency scale is replacing that. That doesn't mean you have to throw your textbooks away. That's not what we're saying. But you're also not having to cover 565 pages of every single textbook. We want to go deeper, and we want to do a better job at covering the material or teaching the content than just covering a bunch of material. This is what the proficiency scales look like when the NED purchased them. I don't know if you guys have kind of gone through the history of how we got where we are across the NED. The NED had been working on moving towards standards-based learning. They started in committees developing proficiency scales, but I guess I would say the grassroots started moving a little faster than the top could get that material done. And we knew that in order to create proficiency scales for all subjects, all grade levels, it would take years. So the NED graciously purchased Marzano proficiency scales that were pre-built, then went through a process of which saved us probably about 3 years of work. Then went through the process of customizing those. So committees of teachers, did anybody serve on a customization committee? I think maybe Kalisha and Shanina did. Okay. Worked with groups of teachers that came in, went through that material, through the proficiency scales, aligned them to our current standards, our NED standards, and then selected in the 2.0 area, and remember the 2.0 area is the basic knowledge and skills, cut that down so it's a doable amount. The scales were overbuilt on purpose so that teachers or districts could select what they wanted to focus on. So the scales, the 2.0 level is customizable. And that's how we got to where we are today in the toolbox, which I'll show you, the NED toolbox, where these materials are available to the NED customized scale. So that represents that it's been aligned to the NED standards. It's been customized so the 2.0s have been downsized to a doable proportion, and we'll have the big idea and essential question. So up at the top, you can see the title there. That's what we refer to as the measurement topic. That's an overarching big idea that will have multiple elements. Shanina and I talked about common language. We're going to use some, even I find when I read Marzano's books, Sometimes they're using different language interchangeably. So if we say a word and you're not quite sure what it is, what are you talking about? So usually the 3 point, oops, I was trying to do my little pointer and went, okay. Right here, usually the 3.0s in a system, they would be referred to as the standards because they would be prioritized standards. But on this scale, we refer to them as the elements or the 3.0 content because they are still aligned to our NAD standard is still the base of what we're taking those from, if that makes sense. These also can be referred to as learning targets. So the 2.0 is the simple content. That's the basic foundational knowledge students would need to know and be able to do, would have your vocabulary and your basic skills in order to reach that 3.0, which that's kind of the standard level that we want all kids to know and be able to do by the end of that school year. And then the 4.0 is the more complex content. Sorry, I'm roaming and buzzing and all kinds of stuff here. The NAD also did student-friendly versions that are available on the toolbox as well. Again, the proficiency scale becomes the heart of everything we do in the classroom. Once you start moving this direction, your mind, instead of thinking about, like I said, the textbook and what cycles are we covering this year, goes to what proficiency scales, oh, that scale has that. I can teach this because it's on that scale. And while it feels like it may put some boundaries around you, like, oh, I wanted to teach something else this year, it really gives you focus, and that's what I love about it. It gives you a very clear focus, which you can be as creative. It's going to look totally different in Shanina's classroom than it's going to look in my classroom, but the outcomes are going to be the same as far as what kids know and are able to do. Okay, in effective instructional planning in a standards-based classroom and in a traditional classroom also, it wouldn't be that much different, include these elements. Unit plans are based on the concept of backwards design. Do you guys remember going through McTighe and who are the two guys with backwards? Wiggins and McTighe, thank you. Same concept there. That concept hasn't changed. They introduced that quite a while ago. It's thinking about put the end in mind and working backwards. It's similar to what you're currently doing. There's a lot of pieces of standards-based learning that you already do. You're just kind of shuffling them and shifting maybe the focus a little bit. So don't feel like we're asking you to throw everything out. And then again, the focus shifts from the textbook to the P scale. So effective instructional planning will include pacing guides. I think you were introduced to the multi-grade pacing guide yesterday. Well, I better, yeah, sorry, I get off track and start saying everything on one little slide. Oh, that's on a different slide, I'll wait, okay. It includes unit plans or instructional cycles. We may use those words interchangeably, an instructional cycle and a unit plan. They're technically not the same thing, but yeah, we use them somewhat interchangeably. Technically, a unit plan may cover, especially when you get to subjects like ELA, a unit plan may say, in this unit of study, we are covering nonfiction text, and it may have multiple instructional cycles built into it because it may be a 12-week unit. Most of the time, though, a unit and an instructional cycle are one and the same, but that kind of gets a little confusing, so we'll try not to overthink it. Then it also includes the daily lesson planning is incorporated into that. So we're going to take each of these little sections and talk about them. Think about it as an inverted triangle. The pacing guide, as you know, is that big picture. Unit plans narrow down a little bit more, and then daily plans going into that more specific. And let's take a deeper look at pacing guides. You may have also heard these called curriculum maps, year-long plans, similar to maybe what you see in a textbook as well as a scope and sequence. We selected, when I say we, I'm saying NAD. I'm just talking as the we NAD. The NAD, I'll try to say that. The NAD selected the term pacing guide because they didn't want to send the message that it was something that you had to follow rigidly. It's a guide. It's there to help you. It's there to show you how you might pace out the year, but you're the boss of your room and you know your children more than a group of teachers at the NAD working together to create a guide. So that's there for you to change, manipulate, and update as you see fit based on your students' needs. A pacing guide would identify approximately how long to teach each topic. It would determine the most logical order for teaching the content, and that's based on teacher opinion. So you may look at some of the pacing guides that were developed, and I've heard teachers say this. They've said, who would ever teach that first in 8th grade math? And it's like, well, a group of 5 teachers thought that they would, so I don't know. Change it if you don't like it. Oh. And it identifies or aligns your curriculum resources. So what resources would we use to teach that concept? And there's 3 methods in a standards-based classroom of developing pacing guides. It could be based on your current curriculum resource. So when I think about the work that was done previously with math, the lower grades team took that into consideration when they built the pacing guide. They said, you know, our big ideas curriculum resource is what most all of us are using. We're basing this and aligning it with big ideas. So for our pacing guide, let's stay true to the textbook using the proficiency scales, of course, but it's going to pretty much follow along. So the pacing guide pretty much follows the textbook in some of those. It could be based on existing instructional units. Maybe you're a teacher that you've already developed all these very, very cool science units, and you teach those on a 4-year cycle in your multi-grade classroom. You could develop your pacing guide based on those current units as they align to the proficiency scales. Now, you may have to throw out a unit and build a new unit if it's not one of the proficiency scales. But it could be, I see a lot of my secondary teachers that do this. A lot of them have already developed their units of study. They get the proficiency scales and they go, oh, okay, yeah, I'm teaching that, that's over here, I'm teaching this, that's over here. And they're just aligning that pacing guide to what they've already done in the past. Or it could solely be based on the proficiency scales. And some of the teams that worked on pacing guides at the NAD committee level did that, and I saw that especially with secondary. For elementary teachers, we are a little bit more tied to our curriculum resource, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially as multi-grade teachers, because we are generalist. We are not specialists in the areas of, like when I start talking social studies, I'm like, okay, I got to pull out the textbook. I don't know what this is talking about. I can't remember all this. But for a secondary teacher who has taught their content area, they can pull a stack of proficiency scales and just pretty much line them up and, okay, yeah, I know how to teach all of this. So those are 3 different ways, or 3 different methods of developing pacing guides. And they could also be used in combination or interchangeable. Sometimes you may base it on the curriculum resource and sometimes on the proficiency scale. Information on a pacing guide, it will have that measurement topic, which is that overarching topic on the pacing guide, on the proficiency scale, sorry. It'll have the 3.0 elements that are covered, the number of instructional days usually given in this span of time. So if it's you're going to teach fractions for, you think it's going to be 12 days, you'll usually put like 10 to 12, 12 to 14. We've seen that in scope and sequences that we've looked at in the past. When it will be taught, like when in the course of the year it'll be taught, what curriculum resources it aligns to, and then always a place for notes, because this is always, always changing. This is your curriculum in your classroom. So as you do that pacing guide this year for you, put a place for notes so you can make comments on, that didn't work. I thought I was only going to spend 3 to 5 days on that, and I spent 7, This is a pacing guide that was done by the math committee several years ago, and you can see those different components. The measurement topic listed with the span of days, 8 to 10 days. The 3.0 elements that will be covered. The Big Ideas resource where you can find that in Big Ideas, and then any notes. And you can see here that committee said, Big Ideas textbook does not cover identifying prime numbers at the 2.0 level. So as a teacher, I'm going to need to find another resource to teach that because my textbook doesn't teach it. And I'll show you when we look at the toolbox, most all, I shouldn't say that, math and science both have pacing guides already established and aligned with the standards, with the proficiency scales. However, they have not been, for science and social studies, we have, as the NAD has not taken those pacing guides and developed cycles for multi-grade yet. That's coming. Our union has worked on some of that work for science. I know another union has worked on some of that for social studies. So we're hoping we can pull that together and come up with, okay, when you're teaching the proficiency scales, here's the way that cycle should work for multi-grade. Looking at the next level of unit planning, we're going to go dive a little bit deeper into that section. Sorry, I can't steer very far away from that. So unit planning, again, unit planning, instructional cycle, I'll use those terms interchangeably, even though technically a unit plan can represent a larger period of time. And I'll show you a little bit about what I mean by that when we look on the Padlet. So an instructional cycle has 8 steps. I think some of these you'll be like, I do that kind of just intuitively. Why do you have to write it out? And you're also probably going to feel like, if I made you build a unit plan today, oh, this is just like they made us do in college. I hear that from teachers a lot. This is just like those 5-page things they made us do in college that we never used. Sorry, university people. And I say, yeah, it may feel a little bit like that, but just like the purpose of us doing that in the university level and the purpose of us doing that now is once we practice through that, it does kind of become intuitive. It becomes a part of who we are and what we do. But unless you intentionally practice that, it doesn't become intuitive. All right, so the instructional cycle steps. Step 1, and 8 steps seems like a lot, but it's not that bad. Step 1 is planning the cycle, reviewing the standards for the cycle. 3, determining the collection of evidence, writing a SMART goal, planning and teaching the daily lessons in the cycle, administering and scoring the common assessment. Now we're going to talk about that one. We'll actually talk about all of them, but we probably will not have common assessments. Implementing the assessment data protocol and providing support for all learners based on the assessment data. These first 4 are done before you ever start teaching. So you're going to plan the cycle, which, yeah, we'll talk about each one of them. Review the standards, determine the collection of evidence, and write a SMART goal. The others are done, and I like to say number 5 should also be done before you start teaching. You really should plan and teach, well, you should plan the daily lessons. However, the reason it doesn't have that in the have to do before you start the teaching is it's a fluid process. You know that now. You may plan your month of lesson plans or however many you write in those little boxes, or I guess you're probably not writing on those little boxes anymore. I'm sure you have something on the computer and it's digital now. You know you're always moving that as kids, oops, they didn't get that, let's shift that down, or oh, I need to reteach that, or hey, they already know that, I need to move ahead. That's the purpose in this, is that it's a fluid process. It goes where your students need to go. The difference is we have a target, a very specific target. It's not just I think they sort of got it. They all made a 100. It's they know this content that's on the proficiency scale, so there's no point in me spending more time on it, or they don't know it. I need to back up and teach that. This little statement at the bottom is an important one. It's one I didn't understand when I first started working with standards-based learning in this fashion. Units can be based on an entire scale. You see that with math. You'll have a fractions unit, a fractions proficiency scale for 4th grade, and you teach that fractions unit. It can be based on part of a scale. An example of that would be ELA. Oh, ELA. You have a scale for decoding, you have a scale for writing, you have a scale for something else ELA-ish. And you're going to pick different pieces of that to build a unit of study around a book or around something that you're doing in your classroom. Your grammar, it's all going to be integrated together. So you're not just going to do one scale and move on linearly in a linear fashion like you would with math. Or it can be based on multiple scales, like the example I just gave with ELA. Actually, the part of a scale, a better example for that one is math kindergarten. The kindergarten math scale for comparing numbers, or even what's the one where they know their numbers? What's that one called? Number recognition. I can't remember what the name of the measurement topic is. It goes 0 to 100. Am I going to do that in one unit? Of course not. I'm going to do a unit of 0 to 10. I'm going to do 10 to 20. I'm going to do 20 to 50. I'm going to do 50 to 100. So I'm going to break that scale up in portions throughout the entire year. So I think when I first started this, I was like, okay, for every scale I build a unit. And I'm like, oh no, that doesn't work. So just keep that in your mind. It's not one scale equals one unit. When we process through unit planning, we process through asking ourselves these 4 questions of a professional learning community. Have you guys had professional learning community training? Any conferences doing PLC work? Some? Okay. So you'll see these in the work from Richard and Rebecca Dufour. What do we want all students to know and be able to do? Identifying that. How will we know when each student has learned it? How will we respond when a student experiences difficulty in learning? And how will we respond when a student already knows it? That's the purpose, those 4 questions. As we talk through and work through developing a unit, we want to make sure we have answers to those. The other one that gets added, that Marzano adds in, which I think is hugely important, is considering what teaching practices will we use that will lead to student growth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So let's look at each of those steps. On the Padlet that you guys have from Lake Union, you'll see a link to my Padlet there. And there'll be a document on there that goes through this. It kind of makes it, like I said, it kind of makes it feel like it's, an assignment. Here's a university assignment of just step through the steps of building a unit plan. But it just, hopefully it helps to demystify the process a little bit. So first you're going to identify the focus of the cycle. That was step 1. This is where we answer the question, what do we want all students to know and be able to do? Basically, what is the topic of study for this unit and how much time will I spend? So that little top portion of the unit plan template gets filled in. This is grade 4. It's a unit plan on place value. I'll be teaching it in quarter 1. I'm going to spend 7 to 9 days doing that. And there is also a unit plan template on the Padlet. And this is a unit plan template. The NAD and our Marzano representatives recommended this also, that we have a common unit plan template that we utilize amongst our, we'll just call it district, because that helps us to share resources with one another. That sounded like a really great idea to us in the beginning. But as I've created units and worked with teachers to create units, I'm like, it's a great place to start, but I would say don't feel stuck to there or tied to that. I hope that the NAD will open and broaden that up some so that when we're sharing resources, if somebody has a great unit that's not on the specific template, that we're open to, just still sharing those with each other. But it is a good place to start as you're working with groups that you use an actual template because it helps you have conversations, and it helps to bring structure to that. So this is just that top section filled in. That's all step 1 is. Step 2 seems super simple, and teachers skip over this one. They're like, yeah, we reviewed it, Becky. And I'm like, no, you didn't. Review the proficiency scale. This is probably the hardest part. Do you really know what the scale is asking students to know and be able to do? At a first glance, it may seem really easy, but I tell you, I've spent with a group of kindergarten teachers, the first time I did this process, I think we spent an hour and a half on one section of 2.0s with kindergarten teachers talking in math. No, that's not what they want them to do. No, it's saying to do this. And they came out saying, can't you make these sound simpler than they are? And it's like, well, it is really hard to articulate in a sentence clearly what you want somebody to know and be able to do. So we'll extend grace to those who created them. Ensure that teachers have a clear and common understanding of the knowledge and skills and the scales that are taught in the unit. I'm a huge proponent for professional learning communities of teachers coming together and doing this work together, because it helps us to have that common understanding. The way that I interpret the scale and the way you interpret the scale may be different. So when we come together and talk about it, we learn from each other. And also, we bring that common knowledge and common understanding ensures that all of our students are getting that same level of academic rigor. Because I may interpret it as, oh, that math standard is just saying that kids need to be able to add 5 plus 3, where you may see it as something that's a little higher level of academic rigor than just memorizing a math fact. Consider how the knowledge and skills have been taught in the past. Consider the foundational knowledge needed. Is there something that's missing? I had a teacher tell me recently that he said, and I kind of cringed just a little bit because I'm a rule follower. He said, I had to build some 1.0s, Becky. And I was like, what? You did what? And he said, well, my kids didn't know the 2.0s. And so he actually made content that were prerequisite skills. I wouldn't suggest adding those as the 1.0 because the 1.0 means something different on the scale, that kids can't do it, they need help to do it. But knowing as a teacher, what are those prerequisite skills? If your kids can't do the 2.0s, then you may have to do some pre-teaching to that. Consider the resources that are available for the knowledge and skills. So what resources do you currently have that teach that? Next step, hugely important, this is where that backwards design comes into play. Determine the evidence of student learning. So before you start thinking of all the fun videos, the fun teaching activities, or what the textbook says, stop and ask yourself, what does the assessment look like for this? How will student learning be assessed at each level of the proficiency scale? What would the pre-assessment look like? Would I need a pre-assessment? Checks for understanding, end of unit assessment. Typically, some form of assessment, some evidence of learning should occur every 3 to 5 days. The younger the students, the fewer days between assessments. The older the students, you can have a longer time period. So you may be doing a check for understanding every other day in a lower grade classroom. And we'll talk more about assessment pieces that they don't have to be a written test. It can be an observation. It can be, teachers listening in. It can be an interview, teacher talking to students. So with this sample, you can see just a little block schedule like we typically do a lesson plan. They've intentionally plugged in, okay, I'm going to do a pre-assessment day 1. I'm going to do a check for understanding 3 to 4 days later, another check for understanding my end of unit assessment. So being intentional about those, I don't start this way as much as I used to. When we first started building them, we intentionally plugged them in, but then we realized that they were shifting based on how we taught. Now the process I go through is making myself answer for every 2.0. What does the assessment look like for that? How will I assess that specific 2.0? And then where it falls in the days, I just make sure I'm covering all of those. Write a SMART goal. This one's a little bit tricky for multigrade, and I have to say I don't have it figured out yet, so maybe you guys can help me. A SMART goal, you want a SMART goal that's specific, measurable, attainable, results-based, and time-bound. It should include a percentage that is attainable but creates a sense of urgency regarding the time allotted in the unit. So the purpose of it is to challenge us as teachers, so we can say, I'm going to ensure that 80% of my students achieve mastery or have growth, demonstrate growth in this unit within this time frame. In a model where we were in a large school and we had a PLC of 4th grade teachers, we would set that goal together, and then we would come back after the unit and we would talk. We would say, okay, how'd your kids do? Oh, you had 90% of your kids that got mastery? Okay, how'd your kids do? You had 75%? Man, guys, I was at 50%. What did you do that I didn't do? How did that assessment work for you? So it allows us to kind of work together, learn from each other, and it also, goal setting we know, helps us establish that sense of urgency as teachers. Maybe a little bit of competition to kind of push us and drive us forward. What that looks like in multigrade, Kalisha, how have you used, or Shanina, have you guys used SMART goals in your planning, and how do you use that as a multigrade teacher? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, I've used it a little bit, especially with math, probably. So I just have a document that shows mastery, and if they have to master all of their content, 80% or above, and then I just reteach it.
Okay.
So that's kind of how I've been using using it, and they know that, so they're held responsible.
So you use it more like individual with kids, letting the kids set a goal of how much content they have. Like they've mastered 80% of the standards or 80% of the 3.0s.
Yeah, but then they're, yeah.
Okay, good, good.
Say 80% for each student and as a class. But I did hear in a presentation in Phoenix that we should shoot for 100, and I know it is unattainable, but did you hear that? But we are not going to hold that student accountable for 2 years until they get that unit.
Right.
But we should aim for that. And if it is 80, well, we are happy, but we should aim for 100.
Yeah. That's the 100 is a response I get a lot of times when I talk with teachers about setting a SMART goal. They're, well, it goes 100, it should be 100%. I think the other purpose in setting this is that we really think about what's reasonable and attainable for our students. Yes, while we want them all to leave, and our goal is that they all, by the end of the school year, leave with that knowledge, is it reasonable that in 12 to 14 days of this unit that Johnny, who came in and doesn't know his alphabet, is really going to be able to attain that? It's not. Does that mean that I give up on him? No. That means that I know it, I recognized it, I've acknowledged it, and now for my 20%, I really have to challenge myself to build those activities that they need to move them the next step. Yes?
But in a small school, if you only have two
yes,
students,
yeah.
you're already at 50% if one
Right,
doesn't get it.
right.
So you have to be at 100%.
I know, that's... Well,
So that's why I've done it individually.
Yeah.
Like you have to master at least 80% of this content. I want 90 or above.
No, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
Even though I think even though you may only have one student,
Yeah.
is it realistic that student masters? It may not be for that student.
Right.
So I think the piece of it here, and like I said, I haven't answered this for what it looks like for multigrade. I know one of you great multigrade teachers is going to figure it out, and I'm going to go, oh, that's it. So what we want it to do is help us think about where our students are, how to get them there, and give us that sense of urgency to stay focused on driving, that sounds terrible, driving the curriculum, instead of like, oh, well, I've got an extra day I could do on this over here, which I was really bad about. Let's do this fun activity, which we do need to have fun, but we also need to stay focused and make sure that we're focused on the content. So yeah, I love how you guys are using that goal setting with students. And we'll have to discover more of how we might use that for teachers to establish that goal setting. Totally makes sense when you have a whole classroom of fourth grade teachers and you have a team of fourth grade teachers to work with. But yeah, not sure about multi-grade. Okay, I think we've covered that one enough. And let's jump into that next layer. The daily lesson plan starts with step 5. All right, you want to plan to teach the foundational knowledge early in the unit. Where would I find the foundational knowledge on the proficiency scale? Level 2, right. The goal should be to develop lessons that prepare students to be proficient at the 3.0 level. You need to consider the instructional strategies that are appropriate for teaching each level of the scale. Are you guys familiar with NASOT or New Art and Science of Teaching? Are any of your conferences using that as your teacher framework? Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that because they kind of go hand in hand. Daily planning is a fluid process. The result of each assessment, those evidences of learning that you're gathering, remember assessment doesn't mean test, just means you're doing a check-in, may change the instructional plans. I think you already do that. You're really good at that as multi-grade teachers. But just realizing that when you move into SBL unit planning and giving yourself that permission. However, also knowing that, and I've been in a lot of classrooms, traditional and standards-based, if I see that not all of my kids are making progress in exponents or whatever in math, and I'm at the end of the unit and I've spent 12 days, if I spend 24 days, what am I going to give up? So sometimes you have to cut your losses and move on and come back to it later. And I think that's also why that 80% doesn't need to be 100%, because I'm going to keep bringing things back. I might say, exponents was a total fail. I'm going to move on to this, and I'm going to come back to that later because they may be better prepared for it later. Or, can I do 2 or 3 days here? Can I afford 2 or 3 days? All right, planning, instruction, and activities. For each of those 2.0s, and the 3.0s and the 4.0s, you kind of go through the same 3-step process. First, I can't say this enough, unpack the learning target. Learning target I'm using here as whichever 2.0, 3.0, or 4.0 you're working on. Unpack that. What is it really wanting the student to know and be able to do? What does success look like for the student at that 2.0 level? Determine the cognitive demand of the learning target. Consider the verb and the context. We were trained that taxonomy is always, bottom up. If you have the word this, then it's always the cognitive demand's always going to be lower. That's not always the case. Context matters. You may ask a student to describe a metaphor. If you ask a student to describe a metaphor, they may give you a definition or an example. That cognitive demand is low. You could use describe in another way, like describe the events of the characters leading up to whatever in a certain book that you're reading that may have a higher cognitive demand using the same verb. So the verbs are important, but also consider the context when you're looking at those targets. And then you want to select an instructional strategy that matches the learning target's level of cognitive demand. This sounds a lot more complicated than it is. Basically, these 3 things are saying, know what it's asking you to do. Don't just get stuck that, describe is always easy, so it's a lower level learning. And think about how you're going to teach it. Think about if it's something new to students, then direct instruction would be an appropriate instructional strategy to use. If it's something that you're moving towards those higher levels of 4.0, then you wouldn't necessarily, you may have some direct instruction, but you're also going to have some knowledge and application lessons that you move towards for those students. And there's a handy-dandy chart to help you with that. I really like this chart because I do think it connects really well to the levels. So foundational knowledge, those direct instruction, there's low student autonomy, and they're going to be our verbs are going to be in the retrieval and somewhat a little bit moving into that comprehension level when we look at those academic verbs. And then as we move up, as we start to release to students, then we move to those deepening thinking, grouping students for analysis level tasks. And then academic rigor lives here in that complex where the students have that power and autonomy over their learning. And then the verbs are also changing, but so is the content as we go up and across. Those charts are on the Padlet for you. This is just another way of looking at that. The autonomy gradually releases and the complexity increases as we move up. If you were partnering this with New Art and Science of Teaching, which we do across our union, there are teaching strategies aligned to each of these. So when I'm developing lessons in the 2.0 area, I know that I'm in this area. And so I can go and look for teaching strategies that help me to present that task or those skills to students. And that's kind of helpful because it's I don't know, let me get some ideas over here. This is I put a lot of taxonomies on the unit planning because if we were actually going to be planning a unit, sometimes we get stuck, and going to a taxonomy is very helpful. I like this Marzano taxonomy because it has the verbs listed and the terms here in the middle, but then it kind of has some questions, sentence stems, and products. So that helps me as I'm thinking through. I'm okay, if I'm asking students to list, I know that's a pretty easy one, but I can't point there, to list, which is in the recall, I could question saying, can you list, or can you give examples of, or there's some products that the students can develop also. There is a chart like this for each level of the taxonomy, and those are on the Padlet for you. Okay, that step 5 is developing those lessons, which is where a bulk of the work comes when you're developing a unit. And Shanina and I are going to break that up for you a little bit more and give you kind of some examples share some examples of some previous units and make you do a little bit of thinking as well. Step 6 is administering and scoring the end of cycle assessment. You want to collect data that indicates how the students are performing on the proficiency scale and determine the importance of that is how is that data going to help me use the rest of the instructional time that I have? Do I need to add more days? Do I need to revisit this later on? I think that we are pretty good at doing that. At least I hope most of our teachers are. When we give an assessment, we're analyzing that assessment and going, oh, they bombed it. They need more. We're also going through step 7, that as assessment data protocol, and asking about the results of the assessment. Where did the students perform well? What parts did they struggle? Do we need to revise any assessment items? Is there one assessment that the kids totally bombed or one piece? Maybe I need to rewrite that. Maybe I didn't teach it well. Which students are in need of special attention? And are there other important findings about the assessment that we need to record? So you're looking at your data, step 6, and then you're analyzing that data, step 7, and saying, how can I improve that? As a teacher in a multi-grade where you're the only teacher there, making notes about the assessment on your assessment or on your unit plan can help you to improve that for the next year. I know you're busy, but just jot down those notes somewhere, and then you can continually start improving those assessments that you build. What I love is having teachers build, like I said, we're trying to move towards professional learning communities, even with our small schools, and having our teachers build those assessments together, even though they may only get together 4 times a year, 4 or 5 times a year. When they come back at the end of the school year or the beginning of the next year, they have those notes to say, okay, that fractions test that we built was a total bomb. let's spiff this up, or we didn't do the right instruction there. That is hugely, to me, just beneficial for you as teachers when you have those opportunities to help you grow in your practice. And also it's just validating too, to be able, it's lonely out there as a multi-grade teacher. I know that when I got to a certain point when, after 5 years of teaching, the first 5 years where you're like, do I even know what I'm doing? And then started moving on to the next years, I was hungry for some feedback from someone. My superintendent came twice a year. Probably would have come more except the blizzards. I taught in Montana my whole career, so, sorry, can't get out there, those roads are closed. But I was hungry for feedback, and I just think how important it could have, how beneficial it would have been for me to have colleagues that I had, even though I wouldn't because teachers are sometimes saying to me, well, Becky, there's no way we can have in our PLC where we can discuss all these grades, all these subjects, all these units and everything. And I'm like, but if you have those conversations around one, it helps you grow. We all learn from that. And anyway, that teacher isolation is a huge challenge for us. And I really think as we move to standards-based learning, we can start asking ourselves, can we do better to break down those walls of isolation? And we can become collaborative learners as well and do what we're asking our students to do. Sorry, that was a little side note. I was kind of saying that for the administrators in the room. Get your teachers together. It's worth it. Step 8, provide support for all learners. You're going to process through how can I help those kids that I'm not meeting. Plan, and I've heard teachers that I've worked with in public schools that, I've gone to learn from them in unit planning and said, what's been the biggest challenge? And they say, when we don't do this step. When we're like, when we're unit planning and we're like, we'll just get to that. When we get there and we see that Freddie's not learning, we'll just figure out what to do with him. And they said, no, make sure you think through this step up front while you're unit planning. You may not use all of those ideas that you come up with of how you're going to support learners or how you're going to differentiate, but having that list will save you a tremendous amount of time. And Shanina said this to me when we were talking on Zoom recently. She said, and I think this applies here, you don't have to redo everything all the time. So every unit, there's a lot of things, once you've brainstormed some ideas and strategies you're going to use, you may take those same strategies and use them for other units, especially in these areas of instructional supports and differentiation for learners. You want to build in a couple of days at the end of every unit, 1 to 2 days, to really focus on a reteach and enrich day. So the way this would work in a large school might look like my 4 fourth grade teachers all come to the end of their unit in states of matter, and we've got some kids that still are at the 2.0 level, and they're like at a 1.5, and we're at the end of the unit. We've got some kids that are ready to do a 4.0, and we've got some kids that still need some support on the 3.0. So if I were in a larger school, we might divide up our team. You're going to work with the ones that still need the 2.0s. You're going to take some more 2.0s, so you guys cover the struggling learners. You're going to take the 3.0 kids and you do the enrichment kids. And we're all going to divide it up to make it easier for us. Beautiful. Does that work for us? No. Nice idea, right? But you multi-grade teachers are the masters at differentiation. I tell you, if I could get my single grade teachers to differentiate as much as you do, so build in those 2 days. I know that you guys, like I said, are the masters of differentiation. You may have a group of kids over here that are working on a task that you've pre-planned for the 4.0. You've got these kids over here that might work with your little volunteer aide that comes, and then you've got your struggling learners that maybe you're going to be working on to bring up. Or you're partnering. You've got your kids that are ready for that 4.0. You're going to be tutoring today. You take these kids, 8th graders, you take these and you spend 30 minutes trying to bring those kids up. So planning, how are you going to support all learners? Okay, in that support for all learners, you guys are familiar with the terms accommodations and modifications. Accommodations changed or changes to how information is presented and how students are asked to respond, where the instruction takes place. We can provide accommodations for all students. It doesn't change the level, the grade level of learning. You may have students in your classroom that need modifications. So think about those students, and those are students that may be on an ISP or an IEP, supports to help those identified learners, and it does change that learning expectation. You may actually build a modified proficiency scale for those students, which might include just as simple as, I'm going to highlight in green on yours what your 3.0 is, and you're communicating that with parents. Instructional supports, those are things that we can incorporate into all the learning opportunities that we're thinking about. How am I going to help all kids get there? They may be things like graphic organizers, charts, different tools that you would use in the classroom that are going to help your kids get there. Think about those instructional supports as you're building your unit plan. Okay, this is the section that shows, just on the unit plan, answers that question, what will we do when students have not learned? So going through and intentionally, here's some support options. I really love doing the common errors on unit plans when I work with other teachers. Math and science are the 2 areas I found the most helpful. Kalisha, have you found those beneficial as well? How have you, when you've filled those in yourself, how have you found that information? Does that question make sense? So let's say I'm starting a science unit and I'm like, how do I know what the common errors are? Some of them may come from my own knowledge and experience. Have you found any other sources that you've used for those that's been helpful? Or just past experience? This is another area that as you teach it, it changes. So just go right in there and type on that unit plan when you're like, oh man, they didn't know this. I need to focus on that error next time.
Sometimes the textbook does give some indication.
True.
Like this might be an area of concern or some students might, so you can add those into your
Yeah. How many of you have been using AI for lesson planning, unit planning? Yeah, I know. Don't be embarrassed. Could you turn off the recording now? I'm just kidding. Don't record us. Hey, use what you got to use, right? Anybody else using AI in some form or another? Yeah, good. I have found, or my teachers have showed me, they're the brilliant ones, that using an AI like ChatGPT or what's the one that comes on Chrome, the Chrome extension?
Are you talking about Gemini?
No, it's one for schools that's attached, specific for teachers, that's on, and it's a Chrome attachment. I mean, you can tell I'm not technologically savvy. I love ChatGPT, but the others, anyway. Typing in one of those, what are common errors for students in second grade electricity? And boom, there's, which one?
Is it Brisk?
Yes, brisk, yeah. Yeah, brisk. Yeah. Drink, help, whatever, it is a tea. It's caffeine. Reteaching strategies, thinking through, what if I need to reteach this? How could we provide some reteaching opportunities? What are some reassessment strategies we could use? And then generating some ideas for that enrichment extension activity. We've listed, what will we do when students already know it? Oh, that's probably one area that we're not the strongest in, because a lot of times we're like, just go on to 5th grade math. We don't have time to enrich your life right now, or that is enrichment, just moving on to the next grade level. So really processing through what would that look like. In this particular instance, they've given, Shanina, I think you actually built this unit. You and, anyway. The 4.0 identify patterns when skip counting by a given number other than 1, 5, 10, or 100. So that team built an interdisciplinary unit at the end of the unit where kids could count, buy toys from a toy store, and great fun. So they don't all have to be wildly creative and fun, but just thinking through that process helps you be prepared for it. Okay, how, in the next few minutes, how is the information that I shared with you on standards-based unit planning the same or different from your current practice? What are some similarities and what are some differences? And I know that was a speed lesson.
Building in time at the end of the unit to reteach.
A new idea or same as what you currently do? New idea. Okay, good. Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
I think I was trying to hit the focus that different, I see the different models and targeting those for each individual, personalizing it. It
Yes.
helps break that down.
Yep, good. So that proficiency scale, how that learning progression is, yeah. I'll share a little bit about my own experience going from traditional classroom teaching forward and what that's looked like when we get to the end. Other things that are the same or different.
I think we are all doing this already. Now it's a matter of putting it on a plan and being intentional about it, but we know this process, we use it as...
That's right. I think there's a lot that's the same. I do. I think there's a lot. Shanina, tell me some of the things that are the same.
For example...
Before you started standards-based learning that you brought along with you.
I was saying, if I was following the book and someone wouldn't get the concept, I would reteach it.
Right. Yep. I think some of the things that are different are, and I think you mentioned that, is really fine-tuning now. That I'm not going this really broad, just covering my content, but I'm really fine-tuning it for those levels. I'm getting really specific, getting really clear. Yes, Kalisha.
A big part of this is that we're allowing students to be exposed to what they're learning before they're learning it. So they have everything in front of them.
Yes.
They get that big idea. We as teachers have always been privy to that knowledge, but now we're giving it to our students and saying, you get to be owners of your own learning.
That's right.
And I absolutely love that component, that they get to do that backwards learning or thinking first.
Yeah, and a huge part of this, from what Kalisha is saying, that I'll try to pull that in as we talk about the different subject areas through the other days, is sharing that proficiency scale in some form with your students. And the goal setting that Kalisha and Shanina both have said, did you notice what they were like? My students know that they've got 80% of the standards. Well, how do they know? Because you shared those scales with your students in some form. I have seen that from kindergarten. I have not seen that in pre-K. I have some people challenging me to show us how this works in pre-K, and I'm like, let me think on that. But from kindergarten all the way up, where kids are owning their learning because the proficiency scale is presented to them in some way or form. It looks totally different in kindergarten than it does in high school. And during the break, I'll try to grab some samples of that. Yes?
I have seen teachers training their kids in preschool by doing skills, how to
Yeah.
tie your shoes, so
Right.
so they are exposed to a journey in learning, following a simple proficiency skill, even
Right,
how
right.
to swing, so basic skills, and then they will be prepared for content.
That's right.
Kinder.
Yep.
Yeah.
I've not seen a lot of proficiency scale visuals, though, for pre-K. You know what I mean? That's what what does that look like? I think we could create it, though. All right, let me see what's next, and I think this may be a good... Yeah, let's stop there because we're going to look at a little bit about classroom assessment when we come back, and I will try and share some examples also of using scales, because I think that's where the power clicks, is using scales with your students. And that's where I've seen teachers have their biggest aha moments. So, all right, let's take a break. And what time are we supposed to be back here? 10:15. Oh, so I can give me a few extra minutes. All right, thank you guys.